Hello, everyone, and welcome to Lecture 26 in our course on general psychology. And this will be a standalone lecture, so this unit will consist of this lecture only. And this lecture is about stress and the psychology of stress. So what we're going to do is look at stress. First, of course, as always, we have to define our terms, and we'll talk about the causes of stress. So stress is an internal experience. We'll see that it has both physical, in this case physiological, and psychological components. So we feel stressed, but our bodies also exhibit signs of stress, especially if that stress becomes long term. So we'll look at causes for these responses and what these responses are. And then at the end of this lecture, we'll look at how people deal with stress. So how do you manage this? And people approach this in various ways. There is no right or wrong answer here. It's just what works for the individual. But there are different ways of dealing with stress and avoiding stress in the future. So in particular, we're going to see that we think of stress as a negative phenomenon in our lives, and we've all experienced stress from one time to another. But there's a reason that we have that response, that in fact it is evolved to help us cope with difficult situations, and that the physiological nature of stress, especially, uh, again, it is intended to help us deal with stressors, those things that cause us stress. We'll see that long-term stress in particular is bad for you, that short-term stress can be okay. Long-term stress, chronic stress, generally bad. And in particular, it's bad for your health. It's not just unpleasant. It can actually cause your health to deteriorate, and we'll see why that is. And we'll also see that how we approach stress is very important. So this is part of that dealing with stress component. And how we mentally approach a stressful situation can have a big impact on our physiology and on our psychology. And we'll also see that we can't control every element of a stressful situation, uh, but our social environment has a great deal of influence on how we deal with stress. There are cultural factors, so social factors, that influence how well we manage stress. And so we'll talk about that at the end as well. Okay, so first we have to define our terms, as always. So what is stress? Some definitions say that stress is anything that throws the body out of balance. It's a bit vague. It certainly covers stress, but anything the body has to get back into balance from is one working definition. Your book, I think, has a better definition, and that is that stress is a physical and a psychological response to some kind of demand or threat. So there are these two important components. We have a response, and we have what the response is to. So there are physical and psychological responses, and again, the particular stimulus that we're dealing with is some sort of demand, something that requires effort or time on our part, or even a threat. And this threat could be physical, it could be psychological, it could be emotional. It doesn't have to be a physical threat, but it certainly can be. That would qualify as a stressor, as we call it. So stressors are the things that cause us stress. And there are a lot of different stressors in our lives. Again, some of these things are physical. So a physical challenge, even if it's something we're volunteering for, if we're exercising, exercise puts stress on the body. But also certainly any kind of physical threat. And from an evolutionary perspective, that would of course be things like predators. So predators are a common stressor for organisms. But of course, there, at least in our case, in humans' case, uh, there are stressors that are more socially based. So anything that threatens your well-being. We have work, we have jobs, you have classes, and so there are a lot of things that are stressors that aren't obvious immediate physical threats, but they don't need to be to qualify as stressors. And so many of these stressors depend on a social environment. And many of the stressors in a social environment are chronic, that is, long-term, recurring. And so things like performing in class, which is obviously relevant, especially for you as we approach the end of the course, uh, that these chronic stressors uh, depend on our complex social environment. So depend on work, depend on jobs, depend on classes if you're a student. They also depend on social relationships. So our friends and family can cause us stress, either by making some demand on us directly, or by sort of by proxy, indirectly, if we involve ourselves in the lives of others. Then when they experience a stressful situation, sometimes we are called upon to help, and so that causes us stress as well. And in an even larger sense, our social environment uh, is filled with groups. These could be groups based on sex, could be groups based on ethnicity, or social class, or nationality. But the fact is that depending on how we're treated, if we are treated as an outsider, uh, and if we are subject to discrimination or any other sort of maltreatment by on the part of a group, that can be stressful as well. Now, one thing that has a big impact on our experience of stress and the outcome is whether we have control over it. So if we can shut off the stressor, that can have a big impact on our well-being, on our ability to cope with the situation. Now, the important thing to note here is it's not turning off the stressor, removing the stressor, although that certainly helps. Simply having control over it, whether you choose to remove the stressor or not, has a big impact. Your book mentions a famous study in which they measured stress responses in individuals while they were performing a task. And they would repeatedly play loud noises, and these were very jarring, and they caused bad performance. Uh, then they basically gave people the opportunity to turn off the noises. And even though they didn't actually take advantage of the opportunity, they didn't press the button that would keep the noises from happening, they nevertheless did better on the task, and they experienced less stress. So it's not controlling the stressors necessarily, it's our ability to control them that actually has an impact. Certainly removing them does that as well, but that degree of control is important. And it dovetails the concept called helplessness that we'll get to in a later unit. The idea that if we have no control over our own fate, if we can't overcome a stressor, then we have a different response versus something that we can overcome or deal with. And so as humans, we're particularly prone to chronic stress. Uh, there's another famous book by a psychologist named Sapolsky, and the book is called Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers. And the idea is that in an evolutionary timescale, animals don't generally deal with chronic stress. So animals don't have to worry about things like jobs or complex social relationships they have to navigate. Their lives tend to be simpler. Now, certainly, they experience stress, again, in the context of a predator, for example, but those tend to be short term. You either escape the predator or you don't. In either case, the stressful experience is over. And so these chronic stressors, these long-term stressors, are fairly unique to humans. We can set up experiments that subject animals to long-term stress. But for the most part, then out in the world, it's really just people that have these long-term stressors. And that's because we live in a complex society. We have things like jobs, we have complex family relationships and social networks. Also, people have internal motivations, which is a big source of potential stress. So you want to do well at something. It's not just the primary reward, food or shelter or water or sex, that you're going to get from completing a task. We also have a lot of internal motivation. And that internal pressure to perform, to do well, whatever it is we're doing, that can be the source of stress as well. That's a form of demand. And so it's not just our immediate physical needs that we're taking care of, as is the case for most organisms. We can have more abstract internal motivations but that creates additional demands on our effort and on our time. We can also experience what's called perseverative cognition. So to perseverate is to keep on doing something, to sort of dwell on a task or on a thought. And because of our complex cognition, humans are susceptible to this as well. Animals don't really dwell on things. They don't think about things over and over again, as far as we know. But if you've ever been up at night mulling over something, or you can't go to sleep because this thought keeps popping into your head, if you're constantly worrying about something over and over again, that's perseverative cognition, and that we think is probably unique to humans. And so, because of our consciousness, we can hold an idea in mind for long periods of time, and this can create additional possibilities for stress as well. So that's sort of the overview of stress. Physically, we have a response to stress, and this is most commonly known as the fight or flight response. And this goes back to other organisms where when a predator is chasing them, if there's some threat, they can either defend themselves, fight, or they can run away, flight. And so the idea here is that this physical response helps the individual prepare for the stressor, helps them respond to the stressor. And physically, this involves the sympathetic nervous system, which is a part of the nervous system we talked about way back at the beginning of the course. And so this is part of the nervous system that deals with this fight or flight response. It gets the muscles ready for action. So it increases blood flow, increases heart rate, increases blood pressure, increases breathing. It dilates the pupils. It also shuts down digestion, for example. So it's a way of shunting, of diverting energy to the muscles and sense organs so that we can respond to a physical threat. And because we only have so much blood, we only have so much sugar and oxygen in our bloodstream, that means taking blood away from things like digestion, reproductive function, things that aren't really important in the short term in dealing with the stressor. And this is mediated by hormones. And then there are a number of hormones involved. Your book mentions ACTH. The downstream effects of ACTH are the release of other hormones from the adrenal glands. And the one that I'll focus on here is cortisol. So there are other hormones as well, epinephrine, norepinephrine. These are the hormones of the sympathetic nervous system. But cortisol is very famous for its effects in the stress response. And in particular, cortisol's long-term effects are thought to be the main reason why chronic stress is bad for your health. So cortisol, its main purpose, is to increase blood sugar levels and to shut down some of the other body systems that aren't important for that fight or flight response. And so this is helpful in the short term, shutting down digestion, shutting down the immune system, shutting down the reproductive system, and getting more blood sugar so that the muscles are better supplied with nutrients. These are all important. These all help us, in theory, to escape or deal with a physical threat. And so in the short term, we have evolved this response to deal with that threat. So stress, short-term stress at least, can be helpful in terms of our physical response to it. So short-term stress is not such a bad thing. Again, we have that psychological and physical reaction to it that helps us deal with the situation. And some of the earliest work on stress and our response to stress was done by a Canadian physiologist named Hans Selye. And he developed what is called the idea of the General Adaptation Syndrome, or GAS. And this is the idea that our bodies go through a particular sequence of steps when dealing with a stressor. The first one is what's called the alarm phase, or the alarm reaction. And this is where we first experience the stressor. We're not ready for it yet. That's why it's called the alarm phase. And so this is our body's response to the first sign that there is a stressor out there. And so we're not very resistant to stress in the very beginning, which we can see in this little dip here at the beginning of the stress response. because we're not ready for the stressor. Our blood sugar is not as high as it should be if we're going to be in the fight or flight mode. Our muscles may not be ready. We may be breathing too slowly. Our heart may be beating slowly. And so during that alarm phase, we're mobilizing those resources. The next phase is called the resistance phase. And this is where our physiological response to stress has begun. And so now we're better able to resist the stressor. So we have elevated heart rate, higher blood pressure. We've shunted blood away from those less necessary systems. And so now we're able to deal with that stressor. Our blood sugar is elevated. Now the final phase, if this goes on for a long time, is the exhaustion phase. So this is where we're burning through energy. Our heart is beating faster. Our muscles are using more energy. We're pulling more sugar into the bloodstream. And so all of that requires energy. And the increase in metabolism burns through energy faster. And of course, we only have so much energy in the body, and our muscles can only exert so much effort in a given unit of time. And so the exhaustion phase is just what it sounds like when we've run through our energy reserves. And we've put strain on our bodies, on our hearts, on our muscles. And so the exhaustion phase occurs when our reserves are depleted. So we've run out of that backup store of energy. And this is a phase you don't want to get into if you can help it, obviously. So this is the phase where we start to get negative health effects in this exhaustion phase. Now, if you reach that exhaustion phase and you're in it for a while, you may start to experience some of the long-term negative consequences of stress. So again, stress is an evolutionary adaptation to deal with short-term threats, especially physical threats. But again, because we're human beings and we live in a complex society, our stressors can more often be long-term. And so there are some negative consequences for that, especially with regard to your health. And this gets into a whole field called health psychology that we're not going to get to delve into that much in this course. But briefly, one thing that happens is the suppression of the immune system. So in the short term, this is good because you're dealing with a physical threat. You may need to run away. You may need to fight. And so it doesn't make sense to spend energy on the immune system when you've got a very real physical threat that you have to deal with. However, if you continually suppress the immune system through chronic stress responses, then you're at more risk for developing an illness. So our immune system is there for a reason. It keeps us healthy, keeps us from getting sick. And so if it's suppressed because of long-term stress, people that are undergoing chronic stress are at higher risk for developing illnesses. It also can have an impact on the cardiovascular system. So short term, you want that heart rate up. You want that blood pressure up. You want blood circulating to your muscles, supplying them with nutrients and oxygen. The hard part is that if this happens over a very long period of time, you start to get cardiovascular disease. So you get hypertension, that is high blood pressure. You can start to get atherosclerosis, hardening and thickening of the arteries. And so this is obviously bad for your overall health and your cardiovascular health in particular. But again, this is the result of a long-term response that was never evolved to deal with long-term stressors. It evolved to deal with short-term stressors. There are other effects as well. I've already mentioned digestion and reproduction. These are functions that get shut down. And again, in the short term, that's good. The same thing happens for growth. So you don't want to expend energy on physical growth of the body if you're dealing with one of these short-term stressors. But in the long term, reduced growth, suppressed digestion, suppressed reproductive function, these are all bad things. So these are all going to have a negative impact on the person's health and the development of the body. And so this here in the lower left is a table from another book, but it lists on the left what the positive effects are for short-term stress, for dealing with that stressor, and on the right it deals with what happens in the long term if you experience those effects. So again, long-term stress It's not a situation our ancestors had to deal with a lot. But in our society, it becomes more and more common, and so we start to see some of these negative effects of stress. Now, it turns out that when it comes to the stress response and the risk of especially cardiovascular problems, there's an interaction with personality. So your book mentions the type A and type B personalities, and those may be terms that you've heard before. But type A personalities are characterized by uh, responding to stressors with hostility or impatience. So this may fall into what your existing notion is for the type A personality, but the hostility part is what's critical here. So people that respond to stressors uh, with hostility are at a much higher risk for those cardiovascular effects. And that's in comparison to type B personalities who don't respond in a hostile manner to stressors. And they've done experiments and studies looking at this effect, looking at the relationship between personality and the risk of cardiovascular problems with long-term stress. Also, as your book points out, uh, aging tends to speed up, seems to speed up when someone's under long-term stress. Your book uses the example of our last couple of presidents. If you look at their pictures when they took office and their pictures at the end of their terms, you see that they've visibly aged. Now, of course, here it's hard to say how much they would have aged if they weren't president, but we do see uh, perhaps more effects of aging than you might expect after 8 years of an otherwise normal life. So all three of our last presidents, for example, got grayer hair. Again, that is a normal part of the aging process. The question is whether they aged more as a result of the stress inherent to the office of being president of the United States. And when it comes to aging, one thing that seems to be involved in that process is what are called telomeres. So these are shown here in the top right, along with the researcher, Elizabeth Blackburn, who discovered them. So I've circled in blue here where the telomeres are. So they are the ends of chromosomes. And they're there to prevent chromosomes from sticking together, but they also, in a sense, protect the chromosome. So if those telomeres get too short, then the cell can't reproduce. It can't copy those chromosomes. They won't divide, and you don't have cell proliferation anymore. So you sort of have a loss of the body's ability to heal and regenerate itself. And it is thought that the shortening of those telomeres is involved in aging, and they do seem to shorten in response to stress, chronic stress. There are enzymes called telomerases that are responsible for rebuilding those telomeres, but they are inhibited by the hormone cortisol. And a lot of these effects that I've just been talking about are due to the effects of cortisol: reduction in growth, inhibition of digestion. The hormone cortisol is released by the adrenal glands, and it has these effects. Again, it's there to deal with the stressor in the short term, but if you have high levels of cortisol in your blood all the time due to chronic stress, then you can start to get these health effects, and you start to see a shortening of these telomeres. And so we think all of these are involved in the apparent increase in the speed of aging when someone's under long-term stress. So that's the physical side. What about the psychological reaction to stress? Well, first, because we're talking about a psychological phenomenon, we have to be aware of it. We have to respond to it. It has to get into our nervous system. It has to register, so to speak. And so when we first experience a stimulus, the first thing we go through is what's called primary appraisal. And so the primary there means first. And so it's the first thing we do. So we decide if something is a stressor or not. So if we are walking at night and we see a shadow move, first we have to decide whether that is a stressor or is it just a tree branch moving. And so that is the first form of appraisal that we go through. Is it a stressor? Secondary appraisal is if you decide that it is a stressor, you have to determine if you can handle it. So is this something you can overcome, or is it something you cannot overcome? And so that is that secondary appraisal step. And as we'll see, that determination of can you handle it or not has an impact on your psychological but also your physical response. So if you can't handle it, if it is a stressor you are unlikely to overcome, then that's what's called a threat. However, if it's something you can handle, so part of that secondary appraisal step, then that is deemed a challenge. So the literature on stress uses those two terms to mean different things. So a threat is in some way more difficult. It's something you may not be able to deal with. And so you actually have different physiological responses to threats versus challenges. And as your book points out, one thing that can be helpful is to interpret potential stressors as challenges as opposed to threats. So if you are more confident in your ability to deal with the stressor, then you tend to perform better, and you also tend to have a different physiological response. And that response actually involves increased arousal. So your sympathetic nervous system becomes more active if you deem it a challenge as opposed to a threat. And your performance, also, as I mentioned, tends to improve. And so when you approach a problem, in this picture here from your book, something like public speaking. So if you think of this as something you're not going to do well at, that you're going to fail at your speech, well, then you framed it as a threat. If you think it's an opportunity to polish your public speaking skills or to inform the audience, you think you're going to do well, if this is something you can deal with, you can handle, then that's a challenge. And you are more likely to handle it well. So it's sort of self-fulfilling in that sense. Now, when we're under chronic long-term stress, depending on your profession, you may be subject to what's called burnout. So burnout is what occurs in jobs that have long-term emotional demands. And this most commonly occurs in jobs that involve helping other people. So if you are a healthcare worker, or if you are a teacher, or a social worker, or if you are on the police force. So these are long-term emotional demands that come from dealing with and trying to help other people. But especially because of the way these jobs are structured, the job sort of never ends. There are always more patients coming in that you need to help. You heal somebody, they leave, you get a new patient. And so you never really get to solve the problem. You may solve it for the individual you're helping, but you're always under this pressure to help another person. And so part of that long-term emotional demand is that you're often dealing with an insoluble or a never-ending situation. And burnout involves a decrease in performance. Your book mentions a classroom setting where a teacher may experience burnout in response to the emotional demands of helping students. But it's also common, again, in healthcare professions. It's common in police, firefighters, social workers. And there's a related phenomenon, especially in the healthcare industry, called compassion fatigue. And this is when an individual experiences a decrease in empathy. So after a while, this is related to burnout. It's not quite the same thing. So burnout, you have sort of an internal and external process. So you have internal motivation to do your job well, and you have some external group that you're trying to help. Compassion fatigue is largely an internal process. So there you have decreased empathy. You have a decreased emotional response to other people that are in trouble. And again, this is because people are chronically subjected to people that are in need of help. And again, it's very common in the healthcare industry to experience compassion fatigue, where you get that decrease in empathy. And that can impact job performance, and certainly it can impact the emotional well-being of the person trying to do the job. So we see a related concept there. You've probably heard of burnout. You may have heard of compassion fatigue, and they're slightly different, but they're both the result of long-term emotional demands, especially in the helping professions. Okay, so those are some ways psychologically that we respond to stress. Now, of course, the question is, how do we manage stress? Uh, we just talked about some ways that stress can affect health, for example. But stress, even short-term stress, can affect performance. And so how do we manage stress so that it doesn't have these big negative impacts on our function? So one way is sort of by managing your own psychology, what's called mind management. And there are a variety of strategies here. One is what's called repressive coping. And that word repressive has sort of a negative connotation, but that's not to say that this is not a potentially effective means of managing stress. This is where you avoid the stressor. Sometimes it's you avoid thinking about it, especially if it's a past traumatic experience, or you avoid it by not putting yourself in a situation that reminds you of it, or where it's likely to happen again. And so by changing your environment, uh, you can also, and in making different decisions, you can also avoid recurrence of that stressor or thinking about it. Another method is what's called rational coping. And this is where instead of avoiding the stressor, the person tries to overcome the stressor. So your book mentions 3 steps in the rational coping process. Of course, the first step is acceptance, where you acknowledge the existence of the stressor. And that can be tough, especially for past traumatic experiences. People don't want to think about them, but they also may not want to acknowledge that they happened. And so the first step in rational coping is accepting the existence of the stressor. Then it's actually exposing oneself to the stressor. So that is allowing stressor, maybe not literally the same stressor, especially in the case of trauma, but exposing yourself to the same environment or milder forms of the stressor. And so here you're not trying to avoid the stressor, you're actually trying to face it. And again, sometimes this is not a practical approach, but by facing that stressor, research shows that it has less impact. Repeated exposure, just like if you have a phobia, repeated exposure is one way to lessen that physiological and psychological response. The third stage in rational coping is what's called understanding, where you try to understand why the stressor has happened. Uh, how does it fit into your life? So sort of a more abstract approach to the stressor. So you've already acknowledged its existence. You've already experienced the stressor or something like it, so you're now more used to it. And now at a more abstract level, you try to understand the stressor's role in your life. Another approach is what's called reframing. And this is where you change the way you think about the stressor. So I've already mentioned an example of reframing, where if you have a public speaking engagement, that instead of thinking of it as a threat, as something you're unlikely to do well on, you can reframe it. So it's stressful, but it's seen as more of a challenge. And you tend to do better, you tend to have fewer negative effects of that stressor. Certainly relevant to a classroom setting, you may have an exam. And so you can think of the exam as a means of being evaluated, which is a stressful way of framing it. But you could also reframe it, the same exam, as a way of demonstrating your competency, of showing that you know something. And so that seems like a simple thing to do, and it is, but it can nevertheless be effective. And there's what's called stress inoculation training, where if you give people these reframing strategies, even something as simple as a saying that can help them cope with the stressor, to deal with it to where they don't perhaps react in a hostile fashion, or they don't frame it as a threat. And so stress inoculation training is kind of like the exposure component of rational coping. You deal with a stressful situation, but you've gone in equipped with a different way of thinking. And so doing this over and over again can help people cope with stress. Uh, the more physical aspect of stress can also be managed. And so one way to do this is through meditation. And meditation is probably a term you're familiar with already, but it often involves having a quiet space, and you clear the mind or you focus the mind on something very specific. And different traditions, especially religious traditions, have different approaches to meditation, but meditation has been shown to have an effect on both psychology, but also on physiology. Experienced meditators can often control certain physiological responses to a degree that other people can't. And so meditation may be one way to manage the physiological components of the stress response. Of course, meditation is largely a mental technique. There's also relaxation therapy where the focus is on the muscles and the parts of the body. And so here, if you ease those muscles, if you reduce tension in those muscles, you also tend to reduce the other physiological components of the stress response. So your heart rate will slow down, for example. And so that's another approach to managing the response to stress. A relatively new approach is what's called biofeedback. And this is where the person has some physiological measurement taken while they're thinking about reducing that physiological response. And so, for example, you could have EEG being recorded, so electroencephalography, brain waves. And so by controlling your thoughts, it's not even necessarily controlling the contents of your thoughts with regard to your physiology. You may be thinking about something else. But whatever works, so to speak, with biofeedback, as long as it produces the desired physiological response. And this has been shown to be effective for stress management. It's been shown to be effective in other domains as well, in reducing epilepsy, for example. So epileptic seizures are the result of coordinated, synchronized brain waves. And so if you can exert some control over those brain waves, then you can exert some control over the symptoms of epilepsy. There's been some success there. Chronic pain is one that your book doesn't mention. So chronic pain is an increasing problem in our society. And so, again, you can't just will yourself, you think, to shut off pain. If you could, anyone would do it. And yet, with biofeedback, there has been evidence that you can sort of control that physiological response. You can control that experience of pain. And it may not be very direct. It may not be thinking about don't feel pain, don't feel pain, don't feel pain. You may be thinking about something totally different. It's just whatever works to reduce activity in those areas of the brain that are responsible for the sensation of pain. And so this has been shown to work with EEG. It's also been shown to work with fMRI. So another form of functional imaging of the brain. But all these examples are ways of controlling your own physiological responses. And of course, one easy way uh, is through exercise. Exercise has been shown to reduce the effects of chronic stress. It also helps other psychological aspects of function, things like memory, for example. And so exercise is also a kind of a natural antidepressant. So people report improvements in mood after exercise. And it doesn't take that much exercise. I mean, as little as 30 minutes of aerobic exercise can help. So those are all ways of managing stress. And then, of course, we have our external environment. So our approach to tasks or our approach to our social relationships also help us manage stress. And so social support, having social networks, is a very big part of stress management. We just talked about managing the body, managing the mind, but also managing your social environment, depending on others for support when you experience stress can be very helpful. People that have strong social networks have been shown to weather the effects of stress better than those that are isolated. In our unit on social psychology, we talked about the importance of social interaction and social networks, and how without that social contact, that lack of social contact is in and of itself a stressor. It causes negative health outcomes. So social support is important. And it seems that there are differences in how the sexes approach stress. Men are far more likely to isolate themselves. to turn to substances, for example, to cope with stress, whereas women are more likely to seek out social contact, to emphasize social relationships. And so that may be one of the reasons that men tend to experience more negative health outcomes with regard to stress. Religion can be a big player also. So belonging to a religious organization and participating in religious practices. And these aren't so much the direct effects. So there have been studies to show that, for example, prayer doesn't improve the odds of recovering from a negative health event. Um, so it's not the direct effects of religious practice, it's the indirect effects. So religious practices often come with a built-in social network. So people have a larger social network, they interact more. Again, social interaction is very important. So those social networks become critical. And again, religious organizations often have large memberships, and so that social support is kind of built in. You also have, along with religion, you often have rules for behavior. Many religions have rules that regulate or eliminate the use of substances, so drugs. Some religions you can't use alcohol. Some you can't use other substances as well, things like caffeine, although caffeine is not as destructive a substance as alcohol by any means. And so that's another possible indirect effect of religious membership is if you follow those rules, some of those rules actually promote healthy living and more effective stress management practices. So some positive effects of belonging to a religious organization. Of course, one way people often manage a stressful task is to put it off, to procrastinate. And some people, as your book points out, say that they do better under stress, that they perform better, that they will write a better paper or do better on an exam if they wait till the last minute and have that pressure on them. Whether that's true or not, there actually are studies showing that procrastination overall has a negative effect. So the effects of chronic procrastination actually end up with higher levels of stress. So sure, during that period where you're putting off the task, you experience less stress than the person who's dealing with the task. But when you wait to the last minute, you experience higher levels of stress, you experience those physiological effects of stress, and in the long run, you perform worse when you procrastinate, and you experience those stressful effects just the same. So procrastination seems not to be an effective strategy, even if people claim that they do well under pressure. Okay, that will do it for our unit on the psychology of stress. Next time, we're going to start looking at psychological disorders. So we're approaching the end of the course, and the rest of the course content will revolve around psychological disorders and treatment of psychological disorders. So first describe what psychological disorders are and how we classify them. How do we describe a certain disorder? What qualifies a disorder? How do we diagnose a disorder? And then we'll look at some specific examples. So anxiety disorders we will discuss. We'll also look at some famous disorders like obsessive compulsive disorder, OCD, which you've probably heard of, and PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, which you've probably also heard of. So these are different kinds of disorders. They are not anxiety disorders, though they have anxiety components to them. That's part of our classification scheme. And then finally, we'll look at schizophrenia, which is a very devastating psychological disorder, and also more common than you might think. And we'll also cover neurodevelopmental disorders, most notably autism spectrum disorder and conduct disorder. So we will cover all that in our upcoming unit, and I will see you then.